the twofold to the recording is one, some of you might know that right now I have started my own online ministry, and it is video based. I'm using YouTube as a platform, and so I create videos and edit them, with as much diagrams and overlays as possible. And so this is something that I'll end up putting on my channel and website. But the other catch to it is also that the church that we have been attending in Sioux Falls, the pastor resigned down there, and they're kind of trying to figure out what to do in the interim time. And I've offered, to teach, and, with maybe a letter of recommendation from some people here. And then also if I could give them, an example or something for they could listen to. And so this is maybe a job interview, So if you want to throw some amens, and hallelujahs in there, and, just kind of, like, man, he's getting the crowd going, just, it's Christmas anyways, so it's joy to the world, so yeah, there's a lot to it. Yeah, don't worry, you're not going to be in it. Paul suggested a GoPro, maybe we could just, point out at the crowd, see who's, paying attention or fall asleep, but, so no, it should be fun. So, first of all, thank you for inviting us up. It's wonderful to see everybody again, and hopefully some new faces we'll get to learn as well. To see family, friends again. It's hard to know if we ever would get the opportunity. I think most know how hard it is to travel with kids regardless. But one thing that Esther and I have said numerous times while we've been gone is that how much we do miss it here, especially in church. And so, but as the saying goes, absence makes the heart grow fonder, so right, Nate, so it is wonderful to give Matt a break for the next 4 Sundays and to celebrate the Advent season with everyone here. So with that in mind, the Advent season offers us a unique opportunity to share our faith, as the Christmas season seems to open up a little more receptiveness to in others when discussing Jesus. I'm sure all of us have at least one friend or family member that is probably not a believer, and in some cases enjoys taking some pot shots at Christianity. And so this series over the next 4 weeks on Unwrapping Christmas is to provide you with more than adequate reasons to, number one, that you can have complete assurance in your faith. So when articles get printed that try to undermine the key tenets of faith or the historicity of Christianity, that that there's no merit to it. And number two, that you'll have the confidence and also tools available to share your faith with those who still need to come to it. We can present a rock-solid case to why we believe what we believe, and that it's not based upon some blind faith or psychological need for a crutch, just so when we have it, available when we struggle. And number three is that we all desire to make a deeper commitment to our faith this next year. I'm sure that many of us have made some mental or physical New Year's resolution lists and that you want to commit to. And so I'm kind of hoping that maybe we can all throw, one in for God this year as well. But knowing that the school district exodus will probably take place in 2 weeks, and I know there's a lot of those still in here. 10 years, I understand. So it's the happiest Friday in all the years, You can sing and praise out there as much as you want. Everybody's going to be right there, So I hope these 2 Sundays will equip everyone with many solid reasons and fresh of mind reasons to have at your disposal. If one person is saved through this, then, mission accomplished. So we'll be going through what I imagine are mental or spiritual walls that non-believers put up when we try to present the gospel with them. The first wall is the idea that Jesus is a myth. Are there any reasons that we can believe that Jesus of Nazareth was actually a real person outside of the Bible? Non-believers will say, you don't get to prove the Bible with the Bible. But at the same time, they want to discredit the Bible with the Bible. So it's funny how it only works in one direction. But we do need to provide them with corroborating evidence that does support that he was a real person. After this, you encounter a wall on the reliability of the New Testament. You will hear, how can you even trust the New Testament? It's been translated hundreds and thousands of times with all the different versions, and they say different things. How can we possibly know what we have today is the same thing that they wrote down 2,000 years ago? And finally, the final wall that I'll address is the idea that Christianity is based upon a collection of pagan myths from Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, Greece, Rome, and in some cases even Nordic countries. The idea here is basically that whoever wrote down these stories robbed and plagiarized from all these other religions and brewed together the greatest myth ever told and stamped it onto some guy supposedly named Jesus. Then Constantine, after converting to Christianity, converted the whole Roman Empire into a Christian state by Christianizing all pagan festivals, and that Christmas and Easter are nothing but repackaged pagan celebrations for the winter and spring solstice. Does this kind of sound right? Yeah. So now that we know, and we know that there are numerous other topics that non-believers will raise up against the Bible and Christianity, the problem of evil. How can an all-loving God allow so much pain and suffering in the world to take place? What about all the atrocities in the Old Testament when God orders, wipe out all the Amalekites and the Canaanites? And what about all the evil that the church has conducted over the centuries, like the Crusades, the Inquisition, the witch trials, and so forth? And I'm not calling them bad topics or discussions to have, but the stressing point to make with them about Christianity is that it's not about what some bad apples did in the past. It all has to deal with Jesus and who he said he was. And that's where the focus needs to stay, even when they're trying to pivot off and go to something else. And the other key to keep in mind is that you have to recognize whether you're potentially dealing with a person of peace or somebody that in that moment doesn't care how many answers or explanations or evidences that you can provide them with. They're still just going to remain in opposition to what you are presenting. Jesus said to the 70 in Luke 10, "The harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. Therefore, ask the Lord of the harvest to send out workers into his harvest. Go, I am sending you out like lambs surrounded by wolves. Do not carry a money bag, a traveler's bag, or sandals, and greet no one on the road. Whenever you enter a house, first say, 'May peace be on this house.' And if a peace-loving person is there, your peace will remain on him. But if not, it will return to you." So Christ has given us basically a simple game plan to follow when we're sharing our faith. You will be able to recognize that if that person is receptive, or if they're just putting up walls and just kind of giving you the, I don't want to hear it right now. But he also gave the disciples an important outlook to keep in mind when we are sharing as well. And in verse 16, he says, "The one who listens to you listens to me, and the one who rejects you rejects me, and the one who rejects me rejects the one who sent me." And so Christ is basically telling us the issue here is not with you or me. It really deals with the person's heart and their current relationship with God in that moment. If they receive our message, we get to praise with them. But if they reject it, we shouldn't take it personal because they're not really rejecting us, they're rejecting him. So let's address the basic question, but vital question today. Is Jesus a myth? Really what the skeptic is asking is there any evidence outside of the Bible that says Jesus existed and did the things recorded in the Bible? Because at that moment, they likely believe that the Bible is a book of myths, fairy tales, and just concocted all by a bunch of religious zealots. So here are 10 secular reasons to believe that Jesus was a real person. Number 1, Thallus. Thallus was a Greek historian in the 1st century AD. He is cited by Eusebius, possibly Josephus, and Julius Africanus. Africanus cites him saying, "As to his works severally, and his cures effected upon body and soul, and the mysteries of his doctrine, and the resurrection from the dead, these have been most authoritatively set forth by his disciples and apostles before us. On the whole world there pressed a most fearful darkness, and the rocks were rent by an earthquake, and in many places in Judea and other districts were thrown down. This darkness Thallus, in the 3rd book of his history, calls, as appears to me without reason, an eclipse of the sun." So basically, Africanus is saying that Thallus recorded this whole world going dark at Christ's death, and an earthquake took place that was so strong that it even split rocks apart. But Africanus challenges Thales that this event was not just a natural eclipse because the full moon was on display, because during Passover is at a full moon. So the moon and the sun are on completely opposite sides where the earth is in the middle. So the only way the darkness could take place is if a supernatural event happened and darkened the whole sun. Number 9, Bar-Serapion, a Stoic philosopher who wrote a letter shortly after the 70 AD destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. He wrote to his son, Mara, son of Serapion, my son Serapion, greetings. What else can we say? When the wise are forcibly dragged off by tyrants, their wisdom is captured by insults, and their minds are oppressed and without defense. What advantage did the Athenians gain from murdering Socrates? Famine and plague came upon them as a punishment for their crime. What advantage did the men of Samos gain from burning Pythagoras? In a moment their land was covered with sand. And what advantage did the Jews gain from executing their wise king? It was just after their kingdom was abolished, God justly avenged these 3 wise men. The Athenians died of hunger, the Samians were overwhelmed by the sea, and the Jews, desolate and driven from their own kingdom, live in complete dispersion. But Socrates is not dead because of Plato, neither is Pythagoras because of the statue of Juno, nor is the wise king because of the new law that he laid down. So Serapion doesn't say Jesus directly, but we know this has to be referring to Jesus because he is called, one, the King of the Jews and the Son of David. And his execution is referred here as unjust because this wise king was instituting a new law. Kind of sounds like the new covenant, doesn't it? Number 8, Suetonius. Suetonius is a Roman historian in the early 2nd century AD. His main work was on his accounts on the 12 Caesars. He says during Claudius's reign, since the Jews constantly made disturbances at the instigation of Chrestus, he expelled them from Rome. Now, it's not completely accepted here that Chrestus here means Christ because the E instead of the I is in place, and so there's debate around that. But he also says in his account of Nero's reign, punishment was inflicted on the Christians, a class of men given to a new and mischievous superstition. We've heard of Nero's persecution, although it's not recorded in the Bible, but here we note that Christianity had, at this point, just 20 years after the crucifixion, had spread to Rome, and after the crucifixion to a point where Nero was punishing them in large numbers. The note of the superstition here at the end gives us knowledge that this new faith that has spread to Rome is not of a normal pagan nature. Number 7, Lucian, a middle 2nd century satirist opposed to Christianity, wrote a satire basically mocking Christians for following any leader blindly. He wrote, "These deluded creatures, you see, have persuaded themselves that they are immortal and will live forever, which explains the contempt of death and willing self-sacrifice so common among them. It was impressed on them, too, by their lawgiver, that from the moment they are converted, deny the other gods of Greece, and worship the crucified sage, and live after his laws, they are all brothers." Lucian lets us know that the idea of everlasting life was a key feature to the Christian faith, and that Christians were willing to die for their faith instead of denying Jesus and following other pagan gods. Number 6, Celsus. Celsus is a 2nd century Greek philosopher who is also opposed to Christianity. Origen cites him saying about the Jews in the Old Testament, "The goat herds and shepherds who followed Moses as their leader were deluded by clumsy deceits into thinking that there was only one God and without any rational cause. These goat herds and shepherds abandoned the worships of many gods." And then he said about Christians, "They wall themselves off and break away from the rest of mankind. They entered into secret associations with each other contrary to law, and they don't even ask questions, they just believe. Thy faith will save thee." He says about Mary, "Jesus was born a peasant, unworthy to be noticed by God, because she was neither rich nor of royal rank. He denied the virgin birth of Jesus and accused Mary of being an adulteress turned out by her husband." Kind of sounds familiar, doesn't it? So we see the virgin story And they even know who Jesus' mother was, being Mary. And then he says about Jesus, "O light and truth," he distinctly declares, with his own voice, "as ye yourselves have recorded, that there will come to you even others, employing miracles of a similar kind." So remember, Jesus said, don't be caught off guard by works and wonders. It could not be from me. And he says, these are wicked men and sorcerers and Satan. So that Jesus himself does not deny that these works are not all divine, but are the acts of wicked men. And being compelled by the force of truth, he at the same time not only laid open the doings of other, but convicted himself of the same acts. And then he says also, Jesus perverted the words of the philosopher Plato. So one, we have a straight reference here to Jesus, his virgin mother, Mary, and that also Jesus was performing miracles. Number 5, Phlegon. He is a Greek historian of the early 2nd century AD. Origen cites him saying, "And with regard to the eclipse in the time of Tiberius Caesar, in whose reign Jesus appears to have been crucified, and the great earthquakes which then took place." Philippon cites him similar with, "Phlegon mentioned the eclipse which took place during the crucifixion of the Lord Jesus Christ, and no other eclipse. It is clear that he did not know from his sources about any similar eclipse in previous times. And this is shown by the historical account of Tiberius Caesar." And now what's interesting about that last line there, about the historical account of Tiberius Caesar, is because it means that Phlegon got the crucifixion account and that the whole eclipse and the earthquake were actually a Roman record that they had recorded. They didn't get it from the apostles or something. And then Africanus cites him with more details, saying that Phlegon recorded that in the time of Tiberius Caesar, at full moon, there was a full eclipse of the sun from the 6th to 9th hour. And we all remember, when did Jesus get crucified? And then Jerome also concurs with this. In the 4th year, however, of the Olympiad 202, an eclipse of the sun happened, greater and greater and more excellent than any that had happened before it. At the 6th hour, day turned to night, so that the stars were seen in the sky, and an earthquake in Bithynia toppled many buildings of the city of Nicaea. So Phlegon, from Tiberius's Roman records, wrote how Jesus was crucified, the whole world went dark from 6 a.m. to 9 a.m., and an earthquake could cause so much immense damage throughout the entire Middle East. Number 4, Pliny the Younger. Pliny was a Roman governor whose letters of correspondence with Emperor Trajan are still preserved. He states, "They, Christians, were in the habit of meeting on a certain fixed day before it was light, when they sang song and alternate verses, a hymn to Christ, as to a God, and bound themselves by a solemn oath, not to do any wicked deeds, but never to commit any fraud, theft, or adultery, never to falsify their word, nor deny a trust when they should be called upon to deliver up, after which it was their custom to separate and then reassemble to partake of food, but food of an ordinary and innocent kind." So we can see here Pliny's description of Christians here. He says that one, they met on a fixed day, likely the first day of the week, Sunday, because that's the day that Jesus was crucified on, or the resurrection took place. And Christians sang songs to him, like he was God. And then this is also a clear indication that Jesus, to Christians, was alive and also God. And even the last detail there, it kind of alludes to what? The communion meal, the Lord's Supper. Number 3, Tacitus. He's a Roman historian and senator from the 2nd century AD. He states, "Consequently, to get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate, and a most mischievous superstition." Tacitus is clearly referring to Jesus here, and that one, he is also the origin of the Christian faith, not a pagan origin that sometimes gets said, and also he's what? Executed by Pontius Pilate. The second one, or number 2, Josephus. He's probably the most well-known Roman historian, and he's also a Jew. His main works mirror the Old Testament in many ways, and then it covers all the way to the 70 AD destruction. He states in the Antiquities of the Jews, "Now some of the Jews thought that the destruction of Herod's army came from God, and that very justly, as a punishment for what he did against John, that was called the Baptist, for Herod slew him, who was a good man, and commanded the Jews to exercise virtue, both as to righteousness towards one another, and piety towards God, and so to come to baptism, for that in the washing with water would be acceptable to him." So John the Baptist was one that popular that Josephus felt, I need to put him into a Roman record. So it wasn't like John was just out in the wilderness with only like a half a dozen guys, which we kind of get a mental picture if we watch a movie. But he had huge following, so much that Herod felt, I got to put him to death because he could start an uprising. And then also, he's doing what? Conducting baptisms. Josephus later writes, "But this younger Ananus, who as we've been told you already, took the high priesthood, was a bold man in his temper, and very insolent. He was also of the sect of the Sadducees, who are very rigid in judging offenders. After all the rest of the Jews, as we have already observed, when therefore Ananus was of the proper disposition, he thought he now had a proper opportunity." So one, we see who are in charge. The Sadducees. I think most people think that the Pharisees probably put Jesus to death, but the historical records show that the Sadducees were actually the ones in charge at this time and the ones that were always buddy-buddy with Rome politically. And if you remember that the Sadducees were also the one who challenged Jesus on the resurrection when they said, hey, we have 7 brothers, they've all died, and they all had the same wife by the Levirate marriage. Whose wife will she be in the resurrection? And Jesus said, and he starts quoting Genesis 1. And so this does make sense that the Sadducees were the one, because in the next part from Josephus, he says, "And Festus was now dead, and Albinus was but upon the road. So he assembled the Sanhedrin of the judges, and brought before them the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ, whose name was James, and some others. And when he had formed an accusation against them as breakers of the law, he delivered them to be stoned." So one, yes, Jesus had a brother. And he also had other siblings as well. And Paul noted James in Galatians as the brother of the Lord. And so James likely got martyred because of his new faith in his brother's resurrection and his deity status. So if you can kind of put yourself into James' mindset for a moment, is like, how would you feel that day when you went from Jesus just being your dumb, older, goody-two-shoes brother to now he's your saving Lord and God? Kind of a switch in dichotomy there. Now, the most famous statement of Josephus is about Jesus. The brackets here are where scholars doubt that this was written by Josephus, but the fact remains is that this entire piece is the exact same that is found in every single record that they have of Josephus being quoted. And he says, "Now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it be lawful to call him a man, for he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as received the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many of Jews and many of Gentiles. He was the Christ. And when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men amongst us, had condemned him to the cross, those that loved him at first did not forsake him. For he appeared to them alive the 3rd day, as the divine prophets had foretold these and 10,000 other wonderful things concerning him. And the tribe of Christians, so named from him, are not extinct at this day." Kind of gives you a little bit of chills, I hope. And number one reason to believe that Jesus existed, the Talmud. The Talmud is a collection of the oral law, the Mishnah, and other rabbinic writings. Rabbis, after the 70 AD destruction, needed to formalize something together because when the temple was destroyed, their whole sacrificial system was completely wiped out. So they couldn't follow the Old Testament law, the Mosaic law with all the sacrifices, so they needed to bound something together. And so if you were to meet some Jews today and they're following something, this is what they would be following. And why I call this number one is because if there ever was a group who wanted to say that Jesus never existed and the whole New Testament is just nothing but made-up fiction, it would be rabbis or rabbinic Jews. And so, tucked away in their Sanhedrin 43a, it says, it was taught on the eve of Passover, Yeshua was hanged. For 40 days before the execution took place, a herald went forth and cried, he is going forth to be stoned because he has practiced sorcery and enticed Israel to apostasy. Anyone who can say anything in his favor, let him come forward and plead on his behalf. But since nothing was brought forward in his favor, he was hanged on the eve of Passover. Almost sounds like they just took it right out of the Gospels and put it in their book, doesn't it? So, when we put all the 10 secular records together about Jesus, this is what you get. Yeshua was born of a poor virgin girl named Mary. He was wise, did wonderful works, a teacher with a large following of Jews and Gentiles. He convicted himself and was found guilty by the Sanhedrin without defendants. He suffered under Pontius Pilate during Emperor Tiberius' reign because of the Jewish leaders' influence. He was crucified by the Jews on the day before Passover while being referred to as their wise king. The world came completely dark from the 6th to 9th hour with a great earthquake that caused immense damage, even splitting rocks apart. And then after his death, his Christian followers met on a fixed day to worship and sing songs to him as to a god. They didn't forsake him, but remained obedient to his teachings and laws, even assembling to partake of ritual food. They break away from mankind, not fearing death, because they believe they are immortal. Pretty much just sounds like the Gospels and Acts, doesn't it? So, we have Jesus' virgin birth, an overview of his whole ministry, the exact same crucifixion account, and how his followers continued on with their faith, all from secular historians. Now, there's only one main event that these guys are leaving out, which is the most important event, the empty tomb. Now, and this is, the resurrection is the ultimate distinguishing event from every other single faith and religion, and likely is what they were alluding to when they kept saying a mischievous superstition that the writers, were trying to convey. And that event is only recorded in the New Testament, which is why next week we're going to discuss, is the New Testament reliable? Now, if none of that convinces them that Jesus existed, maybe this will.
Jesus existed.
So, you know who that guy is? Richard Dawkins. So, he's probably the most ardent atheist that's out there with the God delusion and many other things. So, you can quote Dawkins if you had to. He even acknowledges that Jesus existed. So, next week, we'll be discussing the New Testament reliability, and you can visit the website at any time, and I'll be uploading this. And so I hope that that especially for young people at times, especially if you go to college, or maybe some that have come back from college and have recognized, Christian faith is not always the most welcome thing on campus, and that kind of stuff is not going to get taught to you, and that you can have that at your disposal, and that it's not just, it's just because of the Bible. Everybody around said the same thing.